Henrik Voss knelt beside the open pit in his cabin floor, adding another log to the fire burning 18 inches below the floorboards while snow dusted the planks 3 feet away. What those settlers had mocked as a pointless waste of stone and labor was about to become the difference between survival and tragedy during the blizzard of 1839. Before we begin, let us know in the comments what part of the country you're from, and if you love stories of forgotten frontier wisdom that saved lives, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's tale might be the most incredible one yet. The fire in Edward Marsh's stone fireplace roared with freshly added logs, flames leaping high toward the chimney throat, yet his 2 youngest children shivered on the dirt floor 6 feet from the hearth. It was January 9th, 1839, and the cold that had settled over the small Montana settlement 3 days earlier showed no sign of breaking. Edward added another piece of split pine to the fire, watching sparks rise up the chimney and disappear into the freezing darkness above. The heat followed them. His wife Margaret wrapped both children in every blanket they owned and pulled them closer to the stone hearth. But the cold seemed to seep through the cabin walls faster than the fireplace could push it back. Edward had built his cabin the previous spring using methods passed down through generations of frontier settlers. The fireplace occupied the entire east wall, constructed from river stones mortared with clay, rising 12 feet to a chimney that extended 3 feet above the roofline. He had spent 2 weeks gathering stones and another week building the fireplace properly. Every settler knew that a good fireplace was the heart of a cabin, the difference between comfort and misery through the long mountain winters. His fireplace was built well. The stones were fitted carefully. The chimney drew smoke efficiently. By every standard, Edward knew his cabin should be warm. But it was not warm. Despite the substantial fire burning in the hearth, despite the constant addition of wood, despite the impressive stone construction that had cost him weeks of labor, the cabin remained brutally cold. Margaret's breath formed clouds in the dim interior. The water bucket near the door had frozen solid. The children's faces were pale, their lips tinged blue despite the blankets. Edward could feel the cold radiating from the walls, from the floor, from every surface except the immediate area around the fireplace. Outside, the wind drove snow horizontally across the settlement. Visibility was measured in yards. The temperature had dropped to levels Edward had never experienced, even in his childhood winters in Pennsylvania. Other settlers were struggling with the same conditions. Caleb Morrison's cabin, 200 yards to the south, showed smoke rising from its chimney only to be torn away instantly by the wind. James Rutherford's larger cabin at the settlement's center had 2 fireplaces, both burning constantly. Yet Edward had seen Rutherford that morning looking exhausted and worried, reporting that his family could barely sleep through the nights despite burning wood at an unsustainable rate. The settlement had been established 18 months earlier by 11 families seeking land and opportunity in the territories. They had built their cabins using proven methods, constructed fireplaces according to traditional wisdom, and prepared for winter as frontier families had done for generations. None of them had anticipated cold like this. None of them had built for temperatures that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground, that froze chimney stones until they cracked, that made simply surviving the night a battle against forces that seemed determined to kill. Edward looked at his children huddled against his wife and made a decision he had been avoiding. They needed help. Edward pulled on his heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf across his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. Margaret looked at him with concern but said nothing. They both knew where he was going. Henrik Voss's cabin sat on the western edge of the settlement, deliberately isolated from the other structures. Henrik had arrived in the spring of 1838, a quiet German immigrant who spoke little and worked constantly. He had claimed land, cut timber, and begun building while the other settlers were still surveying their properties and planning their layouts. What Henrik built had caused immediate controversy. Instead of starting with his cabin walls, he had begun by digging. For days, he excavated a pit in the center of where his cabin floor would eventually be, removing earth and rocks in a square approximately 3 feet across. Settlers passing by had stopped to watch, confused by the methodology. Caleb Morrison had asked directly what Henrik was doing. Henrik's response had been simple. He was building a fire chamber. Morrison had laughed, assuming it was a language barrier issue, and explained that fireplaces were built against walls, not in floors. Henrik had continued digging until the pit reached a depth of approximately 20 inches. Then he had disappeared for weeks, returning periodically with a sledge loaded with river stones, dense, heavy rocks that he sorted carefully by size and shape. While other settlers were raising cabin walls and preparing for winter, Henrik was lining his pit with stones and clay. The process was methodical and slow. He built the stone lining 6 inches thick on all sides, using clay mortar mixed with sand he had collected from a creek bed 3 miles away. Settlers watched with growing amusement as Henrik invested weeks in what appeared to be an elaborate hole in the ground. When Henrik finally began constructing his cabin walls, the timeline shocked everyone. Most cabins took 4 to 6 days to raise. Henrik spent 7 weeks on his structure, selecting logs with obsessive care, fitting them with precision that seemed excessive for frontier construction. But it was his return to the pit that convinced most settlers that Henrik was simply strange. After completing the cabin and before winter arrived, Henrik had spent another 2 weeks framing the pit opening with timber beams 4 inches thick, creating a square wooden rim that sat at floor level. The interior opening measured approximately 20 inches square. There was no grate, no cover, no protective barrier, just an open pit in his floor with wooden edges and stone lining below. Caleb Morrison had organized a group to visit Henrik and offer advice. They explained patiently that fireplaces needed chimneys, that fires belonged against walls, that wooden frames around open flames were dangerous. Henrik had listened politely and thanked them for their concern. Then he had lit a fire in his floor pit and invited them to feel the heat radiating from the stone. Most had left shaking their heads. The man had wasted months of labor on a campfire in his floor. Now Edward was walking through a blizzard to that same cabin, hoping the strange German's wasteful pit might offer what his proper fireplace could not. Edward's knuckles were numb by the time he reached Henrik's door. Ice had formed on his eyebrows during the 200-yard walk. He knocked hard, hearing the solid thud of his fist against wood that seemed thicker than standard cabin construction. The door opened almost immediately. Henrik stood in the doorway, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the Arctic conditions outside. Behind him, Edward could see the interior of the cabin, and what he saw made no sense. There was no ice on the walls, no frost on the window, no visible breath forming clouds in the air. Henrik's cabin was warm, not just survivable, but genuinely comfortable. Edward stepped inside and felt heat rising from below, from the floor itself, as if the earth beneath the cabin was radiating warmth. Henrik closed the door and gestured toward the center of the room, where the pit glowed with burning logs. The fire sat in its stone-lined chamber, flames rising perhaps 12 inches above the floor level, completely open to the room with no barrier or grate. Edward moved closer and felt intense heat radiating upward. He knelt beside the pit, holding his frozen hands above the opening, and the warmth penetrated through his gloves within seconds. The timber frame surrounding the pit showed slight charring on its inner edges, but the wood was solid, intact, showing no signs of burning through despite months of use. Edward touched the floor planks 2 feet from the pit. They were warm, not hot enough to burn, but warm enough to be comfortable. He had never felt a warm floor in winter. Every cabin he had ever known had floors that stayed frozen from November through March. Henrik brought him coffee and sat on the floor opposite the pit. Edward noticed Henrik was barefoot, sitting comfortably on wooden planks that should have been freezing. Henrik explained in his accented English that the fire had been burning since the previous evening. He added logs every few hours, but the stone lining held heat so efficiently that the cabin stayed warm even when the fire burned low. At night, he let the fire die to coals, and the stored heat in the 6-inch stone lining radiated warmth until morning. Edward asked about smoke. Henrik pointed to a small opening in the roof directly above the pit, perhaps 6 inches in diameter. The smoke rose naturally through the opening, pulled upward by the heat differential. There was no tall chimney to freeze, no stone column to crack from thermal shock, no massive structure wasting heat by sending it skyward. The system was simple. Fire burned in a stone-lined pit. Heat radiated upward and outward into the room. Stone absorbed excess heat and released it slowly over hours. The floor became a radiator, warming the entire cabin from below. Edward thought of his children shivering 6 feet from a roaring fireplace. He thought of the wood he was burning at an unsustainable rate, while his cabin remained dangerously cold. He looked at Henrik sitting barefoot on a warm floor during a blizzard and asked if the German would help him build a pit. Henrik walked through the blizzard to Edward's cabin, carrying a piece of charcoal and a flat piece of wood he used for sketching plans. Inside, Margaret had moved the children as close to the fireplace as safety allowed, but they were still shivering, despite the massive fire burning against the stone wall. Henrik stood near the hearth for a moment, holding his hand at different heights and distances. He moved his palm close to the flames, feeling intense heat. He raised his hand upward, following the heat as it rose toward the chimney. Then he stepped back 6 feet to where the children sat and held his hand at floor level. The floor was frozen. He asked Edward to add wood to the fire. Edward placed 2 large pieces of split pine on the burning logs, and flames leaped higher, roaring up the chimney throat. Henrik knelt beside the hearth and explained what was happening, using simple drawings on his wooden board. He sketched the fireplace as a box with an opening. The fire burned inside the box. Heat, he explained, always rises. The fireplace was designed to channel smoke upward through the chimney, but heat followed the same path. The hottest air in the room was directly above the flames, rising rapidly into the chimney and escaping outside. He drew arrows showing the heat flow, upward from the fire, into the chimney, out through the top. Very little heat radiated outward into the room because the fireplace design directed everything upward. The stone walls absorbed some heat, but stone was slow to warm and slow to release. Most of the heat from Edward's substantial fire was being sent directly outside through 12 feet of chimney. The cabin was being heated by the small amount of radiant energy that escaped the fireplace opening before rising into the chimney. It was like trying to warm a room by opening the door to a furnace, but positioning that door to face the ceiling. Henrik then drew his floor pit design. The fire burned in an open chamber below floor level. Heat rose naturally, but instead of being channeled up a chimney and outside, it rose directly into the living space. The 6-inch stone lining absorbed heat from all sides of the fire, storing thermal energy. The stone then radiated that stored heat upward through the open top and outward through the floor. Because the fire was at floor level, the heat warmed the lowest part of the cabin first, exactly where people sat, slept, and lived. Warm air rose naturally, heating the entire cabin from bottom to top. Edward understood immediately. His fireplace was a heat disposal system disguised as a heating system. It removed heat from his cabin efficiently through the chimney. Henrik's pit was a heat distribution system that kept thermal energy inside the living space instead of sending it skyward. The difference was not in how much wood they burned, but in where the heat from that burning wood actually went. Margaret asked how long it would take to build a pit like Henrik's. Henrik explained that building a proper floor pit during a blizzard was impossible. The process required weeks under normal conditions. Excavation, stone gathering, clay preparation, careful lining construction, timber framing, floor integration. Edward's cabin was already built, with a dirt floor packed hard by months of use and now frozen solid. Digging through frozen earth would be brutal work. But Henrik saw the children shivering and made a calculation. They could build a simplified version, not permanent, not ideal, but functional enough to survive the cold. They would dig the pit inside the existing cabin, working around the current fireplace. The excavation would be difficult, but possible. Henrik estimated they needed 3 days of hard labor. Day 1 for digging, Day 2 for stone placement and clay work, Day 3 for finishing and testing. Edward agreed immediately. 3 days of brutal work was better than watching his children freeze slowly while his fireplace sent heat up the chimney. They began that afternoon. Henrik brought tools from his cabin, including a pickaxe, 2 shovels, and iron pry bars. They selected a location in the center of the cabin floor, far enough from the existing fireplace to be safe, close enough to the door for smoke ventilation. Henrik marked a square approximately 30 inches across using stakes and string. Then they began digging. The top few inches of earth were frozen hard as stone. Edward swung the pickaxe repeatedly, breaking through the frozen layer in small chunks. Henrik shoveled the broken earth aside, piling it near the door. After 2 hours of continuous work, they had penetrated the frozen layer and reached softer earth below. The digging became easier but still required constant effort. They worked in shifts, one man swinging the pickaxe or digging while the other rested and warmed briefly by the fireplace. Margaret kept coffee hot and brought them food. The children watched with growing hope as the pit slowly deepened. By nightfall, they had excavated approximately 14 inches down. Henrik measured carefully, checking depth and width. They needed 6 more inches, plus space for the stone lining. They worked through the evening by firelight and candlelight. The physical labor generated heat that kept them warm despite the bitter cold. Edward's hands blistered, but he continued digging. This pit represented survival. Every inch deeper meant more stone lining, more thermal mass, more stored heat for his family. They reached the full 20 inches of depth near midnight. Henrik checked the dimensions one final time. The pit measured 32 inches square at the top, with vertical walls that would accommodate 6 inches of stone lining on all 4 sides and the bottom. Edward stood back, looking at the hole they had created in his cabin floor. It looked like a grave. Henrik assured him that by tomorrow evening it would look like salvation. They covered the pit opening with planks to prevent accidents during the night and went to sleep, exhausted but committed to finishing what they had started. Henrik arrived before dawn with his sledge loaded with river stones. He had spent the previous evening selecting rocks from his personal stockpile, choosing the densest specimens for maximum thermal mass. The stones were smooth from water erosion, roughly uniform in size, averaging 6 to 8 inches in length. Edward helped unload them, stacking the rocks near the pit opening. Henrik explained they needed approximately 60 stones for a complete lining. He had brought 40. They would need to gather more. The nearest accessible stones were at a creek bed half a mile south. Despite the blizzard conditions, Edward and Henrik made 3 trips, using the sledge to haul rocks back to the cabin. The work was exhausting in the extreme cold, but necessary. By mid-morning, they had enough stone to complete the lining. Henrik then produced 2 buckets of clay mixture he had prepared the night before. The clay was mixed with sand and a small amount of ash, creating a mortar that would bind the stones and seal gaps. The mixture had been kept near his fire to prevent freezing. They began laying stones at the bottom of the pit. Henrik worked methodically, placing each rock carefully, checking for level and fit. He applied clay mortar between stones, pressing it firmly into gaps. The bottom layer took 2 hours to complete, creating a 6-inch thick floor of mortared stone. Then they started on the walls. Henrik built up the stone lining in courses, each layer slightly offset from the one below, creating a bonded structure that would resist shifting. Edward mixed more clay as needed, maintaining the right consistency for mortar. The stone walls rose slowly, 6 inches thick, built carefully against the earthen pit walls. Henrik used smaller stones to fill gaps, ensuring no large voids remained. Clay mortar sealed everything, creating a continuous thermal mass. The interior chamber emerged as the walls rose higher, roughly 20 inches square, the exact space needed for a functional fire. By afternoon, the stone lining was complete. The pit now had a 6-inch stone bottom and 6-inch stone walls on all 4 sides, creating an interior fire chamber with massive heat storage capacity. Henrik smoothed the interior surfaces with wet clay, filling any remaining gaps and creating a relatively even face that would radiate heat efficiently. Then they waited. The clay needed time to set before they could proceed to the timber frame installation. Henrik explained that normally this curing process took days, but the extreme cold would actually help the clay harden faster. They could continue work the next morning. Edward asked about the fireplace. Should they extinguish it and rely only on the pit once completed? Henrik shook his head. Keep both systems running until they were certain the pit worked properly. Redundancy was survival. That night, Edward lay awake, thinking about the stone-lined chamber in his cabin floor. Tomorrow they would frame it with timber and test whether Henrik's unconventional wisdom could actually save his family from the killing cold. Henrik returned at first light, carrying 4 heavy timber beams, each cut to precise dimensions. The beams were oak, dense, and slow to char, measuring 4 inches thick and 36 inches long. He had shaped them the previous evening, creating a square frame that would sit atop the stone lining and provide a finished edge at floor level. Edward helped position the timbers, laying them across the top of the stone walls to form the pit's rim. Henrik had cut simple, lap joints at the corners, allowing the beams to interlock and create a rigid frame. The timber frame sat perfectly on the stone lining, leaving an interior opening of approximately 20 inches square. Henrik checked the level carefully, adjusting placement until the frame sat evenly. Then he explained a critical detail Edward had not considered. The timber would char over time from exposure to heat and occasional flame contact. This was acceptable and even beneficial. The char layer would seal the wood surface, making it more resistant to further burning. But the initial charring process needed to be controlled. They would start with small fires, gradually increasing size as the timber developed its protective char coating. Henrik produced iron spikes and a hammer. He drove spikes down through the timber frame into the stone lining below, anchoring the wood to the masonry. 4 spikes per side, 16 total, creating a connection that would prevent the frame from shifting. The frame was now integrated with the stone structure, forming a single unit. Edward helped him position the cabin floor planks around the timber frame, cutting and fitting boards to meet the edges precisely. The result was a square opening in the cabin floor, lined with stone below and framed with oak at floor level. Henrik then addressed ventilation. The fireplace chimney could not serve the floor pit. They needed a dedicated smoke exit. He climbed onto the cabin roof and cut a small hole directly above the pit location, approximately 6 inches in diameter. The opening was crude but functional. Smoke would rise naturally from the pit and exit through this roof vent. There was no chimney to freeze, no tall stone structure to crack, just a simple hole allowing smoke to escape while the heat stayed below. Back inside, Henrik prepared kindling and small pieces of split wood. This would be the first fire in Edward's pit. He arranged the kindling carefully at the bottom of the stone chamber, creating airflow space beneath the larger pieces. Margaret and the children gathered around as Henrik struck flint to steel, creating sparks that caught in the dry tinder. Flames spread quickly through the kindling. Henrik added small sticks, building the fire gradually. Smoke rose from the pit and drifted upward toward the roof opening, exiting the cabin cleanly. Within minutes, Edward could feel heat radiating from the pit opening. He knelt and held his hands above the flames, feeling warmth rising. The stone walls began absorbing heat, starting their transformation into thermal batteries that would define whether his family survived the winter. Henrik stayed through the afternoon, monitoring the fire and teaching Edward how to manage the floor pit system. The technique was different from fireplace operation. With a fireplace, you built large fires and added wood frequently to compensate for heat loss up the chimney. With the pit, you built smaller fires and relied on the stone lining to store and radiate heat over extended periods. Henrik demonstrated the loading method. Place logs in a crosshatch pattern, allowing air to flow between them. Keep the fire burning steadily rather than roaring intensely. Let the stone absorb the heat gradually. By evening, the stone lining had warmed noticeably. Edward touched the timber frame and found it warm but not dangerously hot. The oak showed slight darkening on the interior edges where heat exposure was greatest, but no active charring. Henrik explained this was normal. Over the next several days, the wood would develop a char layer perhaps 1/8 of an inch deep. That layer would then protect the timber from further damage. The frame would last years, possibly decades, with minimal maintenance. Margaret prepared dinner while the children sat on the floor near the pit, closer than they had ever been able to sit near the fireplace. The floor itself was warm beneath them. Edward noticed his daughter had removed her heavy shawl for the first time in days. The cabin temperature was rising perceptibly. Henrik checked the roof vent and found smoke exiting cleanly with no backdraft. The system was functioning as designed. As darkness fell, Henrik prepared to return to his own cabin. He instructed Edward to maintain a moderate fire through the night, adding logs every 2 to 3 hours. By morning, the stone would be fully heat-saturated, and they would see the pit's true capability. Edward thanked him repeatedly, but Henrik dismissed the gratitude. He was simply sharing knowledge that worked. If it saved Edward's family, that was sufficient reward. After Henrik left, Edward sat alone by the pit while Margaret put the children to bed. For the first time in a week, the children were not shivering as they fell asleep. Edward added another log to the pit fire and watched flames wrap around the wood. The stone walls glowed faintly with stored heat. He extinguished the fireplace, letting those flames die to coals, wanting to test whether the pit alone could sustain warmth through the night. He woke several times to add wood, kneeling beside the pit in darkness and feeding logs into the glowing chamber. Each time he woke, the cabin felt warm, not just survivable, but genuinely comfortable. By his fourth waking, near dawn, he noticed something remarkable. The stone lining was radiating enough heat that the fire had burned down to coals, yet the cabin temperature had not dropped significantly. The thermal mass was working exactly as Henrik had described, storing heat during active burning and releasing it slowly during quiet periods. Morning arrived with sunlight filtering through ice-covered windows into a warm cabin. The blizzard that had seemed brutal on day 3 became catastrophic on day 7. The temperature dropped further, reaching levels that old-timers claimed they had never witnessed. Ice formed on the interior walls of cabins throughout the settlement. Water froze solid, within minutes of being brought inside. The wind drove snow with such force that it found gaps in the tightest chinked walls, creating small drifts inside occupied structures. At Edward's cabin, snow had blown through cracks near the door and remained on the floor 3 feet from the pit, unable to melt despite the heat radiating from the stone-lined chamber. Other settlers were burning through their wood supplies at alarming rates. Caleb Morrison knocked on doors asking to borrow firewood, having exhausted his own stockpile trying to keep his family warm. His fireplace consumed logs constantly, yet his cabin remained dangerously cold. James Rutherford reported that one of his 2 fireplaces had failed completely when the chimney stones cracked from repeated thermal shock, sending smoke back into the cabin and forcing him to extinguish that fire entirely. His family now crowded around the single remaining fireplace, burning wood desperately while the rest of the cabin turned frigid. Daniel Crawford's situation became critical on day 8. His chimney had frozen partially shut, creating dangerous smoke buildup inside his cabin. He was forced to choose between suffocating his family with smoke or freezing them by extinguishing the fire. He chose to extinguish the fire. Within hours, his cabin became uninhabitable. He carried his wife Sarah and their infant daughter through the blizzard to James Rutherford's cabin, seeking shelter. Rutherford took them in, but his own cabin was now dangerously overcrowded, with 2 families competing for space near a single fireplace. Word spread through the settlement about Edward's floor pit. Settlers who had mocked Henrik's wasteful construction now asked questions. How much wood was Edward burning? How warm was his cabin? Could the pit really work better than proven fireplace designs? Caleb Morrison visited and stood inside Edward's cabin, feeling the warm floor beneath his boots and seeing the children playing comfortably in their shirt sleeves. He asked bluntly if Edward would help him build a similar pit. Edward agreed, but explained they would need Henrik's expertise. Morrison, who had been among the most vocal critics of Henrik's methods, swallowed his pride and walked to the German's isolated cabin to ask for help. Henrik agreed to help, but explained the reality clearly. Building a proper pit required days of work under ideal conditions. In this blizzard, with frozen earth and limited materials, they could only build simplified versions. Even those would take time, and the settlement had multiple families in crisis. They needed to prioritize. Morrison accepted the terms and offered to help with labor and stone gathering. By evening, a plan emerged. Henrik would supervise pit construction in the most critical cabins first, using volunteers for labor and pooling resources for materials. The settlement had mocked unconventional wisdom, and now that wisdom was their only path to survival. The blizzard broke on day 12. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the wind stopped and visibility returned. Settlers emerged from their cabins to assess the damage and count their losses. 3 cabins had sustained structural damage from frozen and cracked chimney stones. 2 families had abandoned their homes entirely, seeking shelter with neighbors. The settlement's communal wood supply was nearly exhausted, but no one had died. The survival rate, given the unprecedented cold, was remarkable. And much of that survival could be traced to the floor pits that Henrik had helped construct during the crisis. By the time the weather cleared, 5 cabins had functional floor pits. Edwards was the original, built in desperate haste but proving effective. Morrison's was completed on day 9, providing immediate relief to his freezing family. Rutherford's cabin received a pit on day 10, allowing the 2 families sheltering there to spread out and sleep comfortably. Daniel Crawford's damaged. Cabin was abandoned, but Henrik helped him build a new structure with a floor pit designed into the construction from the beginning. Peter Gunderson, watching the results, had requested and received help building his own pit before the crisis ended. The pits varied in construction quality. Some had thinner stone linings due to material constraints. Others had simplified timber frames or crude ventilation systems. But all of them functioned on the same principle that Henrik had proven. Fire burning in a stone-lined chamber below floor level, storing heat in thermal mass, radiating warmth into living spaces instead of sending it up chimneys and outside. The difference in wood consumption was dramatic. Families with floor pits burned approximately half the wood of families relying solely on fireplaces while maintaining warmer, more comfortable cabins. Spring came eventually, and with it a transformation in settlement construction practices. New cabins were built with floor pits, integrated into their designs from the start. Existing cabins were modified, with settlers undertaking the weeks of labor required to excavate, line, and frame proper heating chambers. Henrik's isolated cabin became a gathering place where settlers came to study his construction methods and ask detailed questions about stone selection, clay mixtures, and timber framing techniques. The mockery had transformed into respect. Henrik Voss never sought recognition for his innovation. He had simply built what made sense to him, combining principles he had observed in German masonry stoves with adaptations for frontier conditions and available materials. When settlers thanked him for saving their families, he redirected credit to the physics of thermal mass and the simple reality that heat rises. If you wanted to warm a living space, you placed the heat source low and allowed natural convection to distribute warmth upward. It was not revolutionary, it was logical. The floor pits of that Montana settlement outlasted the families who built them. Decades later, homesteaders discovered abandoned cabins with strange square openings in their floors, lined with river stones and framed with charred oak. Some understood what they had found. Others simply marveled at the forgotten ingenuity of those who had survived the impossible winter of 1839.